Let me ask you what seems maybe like a really obvious question. Do you have rights? Okay, now, most of my listeners are American. People who aren't American, at least, are obviously speaking English and probably know enough about America to know that this is a kind of a crazy question for an American to be asking, because the Declaration of Independence says, right, we are endowed by our Creator with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everybody thinks they know that, right? Well, of course, I have rights. They are given to me by God, or some people think they just come to me out of the sky, or they're natural to humans, or different accounts of it. But everybody thinks they have rights, yeah? And yet, at the same time, I am noticing this remarkable phenomenon, which is that we are constantly arguing over who has rights. And the big one, of course, right now is unborn children, right? Do unborn children have rights? Are they people? Are they legal people? Are they natural people? But at a deeper level, of course, are they human beings? And do human beings have rights to life, for example? And we're talking about this in part because as of this taping, we've got a draft opinion leaked out of the Supreme Court, which seems poised to overturn Roe v. Wade and kick the issue of abortion back to the states so the voters will be able to decide whether and when and if abortion is legal. But there's something else going on that you may not have seen in the news because it's not American but Canadian. And I wanted to draw your attention to that as well as a context for what is going to be a Young Heretics deep dive into the long question of natural law and natural rights. We are going to spend quite a few episodes on this. I'm actually not totally sure how many the series is going to end up being. We're going to see how much we can get through at how much length. This is a huge topic, and there are lots of our old friends and lots of new friends that we're going to meet along the way. Remember that this is the classical education you did not know you were missing. It's the kind of thing that you take for granted. Oh yeah, rights. And yet it's so contested in the news and we don't know why. That's the benefit of a classical education. I'm going to talk to you about where this stuff comes from, what the history of it is, and so you can know why you are born free. I said that there was one other news story I wanted to head up, except for besides the overturning of Roe, I wanted to make you aware of this article in The Spectator, who's a sponsor of the show. Great magazine that you really ought to be reading if you're not. And it's called Why is Canada Euthanizing the Poor? This is Yuan Yi Ju is the author. And as always with modern authors, I have no idea if I'm getting that name right or pronouncing it right. But let me read to you a little bit from this article about Canada's now ever more extreme euthanasia laws allowing what's called assisted suicide. That is intervention in order to allow somebody to die, or to, in fact, help somebody to die. In 2015, writes Ju, the Supreme Court of Canada reversed 22 years of its own jurisprudence by striking down the country's ban on assisted suicide as unconstitutional, blithely dismissing fears that the ruling would initiate a descent down a slippery slope into homicide against the vulnerable as founded on anecdotal examples. The next year, Parliament duly enacted legislation allowing euthanasia, but only for those who suffer from a terminal illness whose natural death was, quote, reasonably foreseeable. It took 5 years for the proverbial slippery slope to come into view when the Canadian Parliament enacted Bill C-7, a sweeping euthanasia law which repealed the reasonably foreseeable requirement and the requirement that the condition should be, quote, terminal. Now, as long as someone is suffering from an illness or disability which, quote, cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable, they can take advantage of what is now known euphemistically as medical assistance in dying, MAID for short, for free. Soon enough, Canadians across the country discovered that though they would otherwise prefer to live, they were too poor to improve their conditions to a degree which was acceptable. Things have only gotten worse. A woman in Ontario was forced into euthanasia because her housing benefits did not allow her to get better housing, which didn't aggravate her crippling allergies. Another disabled woman applied to die because she simply cannot afford to keep on living. Another sought euthanasia because COVID-related debt left her unable to pay for the treatment, which kept her chronic pain bearable. Under the present government, disabled Canadians got $600 in additional financial aid during COVID. University students got 5,000 Canadian dollars. Now, this article goes on, and it's really troubling and dark stuff, but I am going to pause it there and just look at these two questions. The question of the right of a baby to live up from conception on and up to the moment of birth, and the right of the poor in Canada to live as well, right? And what's so interesting is that both of these questions were about rights to begin with. The right of the mother, the so-called right of the mother to terminate a pregnancy, is what sort of motivated Roe v. Wade and pro-abortion activists, and the right of the terminally ill or the chronically suffering to end their own lives in terms of Canada. And yet they have ended up in these, to me, manifestly horrifying dystopian conclusions that obviously deprive people of their rights, obviously dehumanize people and make them less than human in the eyes of the law, put the state in the position of weighing their value, either, how much do they cost the state versus how much can they produce, how pleasurable can their lives be, how comfortable will their lives be. And when the state is in the business of deciding whose life has value, then the story of rights, the story of natural law, the story of the founding of America and the tradition of thinking about these things going back thousands of years in the West, that story has effectively been ended by legal fiat. Because when the state is in the business of deciding, you no longer have a right to life inherently as a human being, right? And so this is the first thing that I want to explore, is where do we get this idea that as beings, as human beings, we deserve to live, or we should be allowed to live. We shouldn't have to, kill ourselves, or indeed we shouldn't be killed, in the womb, at late stages of pregnancy, even outside the womb at certain cases. One of the things that a classical education shows you is that these things which we think of as obvious, well, of course I have rights. Of course I have the right to live. Of course every human being has the right to be alive. These things do not just fall out of the sky. They are not intuitive to the vast majority of people throughout time. And you don't just pluck them out of the air because you're such a good person and you and your friends all have common sense. Of course, they're common sense. I want to show you where the idea comes from, that you have the right to be alive. And from there, we're going to talk about the long, long history of how this works in politics, so you can understand not just today, but where you come from and where your ideas come from. Anybody who runs a business knows how tough it can be to hire, especially in this market. You need Indeed. This is going to help you to build your fabulous empire of wealth that you can then contribute to the grand Young Heretics empire as we become jacked, tan, handsome, and wealthy together. Indeed is a crucial component to building your business because they will put all of the hiring process in one place. You can attract, interview, and hire all on Indeed. It's the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applicants that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay, which is a great deal. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites hoping to find candidates with the right skills, you need one powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. With Instant Match, as soon as you sponsor a post, you get a short list of quality candidates with resumes or on Indeed that match your job description, and you can invite them to apply right away. This really is an awesome site. We use it over here at Soundfront. They didn't find me that way, of course, because I just walked in off the street. But all of our, our production and the great work that they do, Indeed was a huge help with that. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/heretics. You got to use my link because it's just for my listeners. You get the $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So this is Genesis 1. I'm reading as ever from the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society translation, which I use for all translations out of Biblical Hebrew. Here we are beginning to read at verse 26. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that creepeth upon the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to every thing that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is a living soul, I have given every green herb for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. All right, that is the culmination of the first creation story. It's told twice from sort of two different angles in Genesis, but I want to focus on this first one because of this crucial phrase: God created man in his own image. That's the phrase that we're focusing in on here. And I'm focusing in on it because I want to stress something that I've said before, which is, look, I think everybody should be a Christian. I think your life will be more joyous, more abundant, more full of truth if you are. But even if you're not, even if you're a staunch atheist, if you're a member of some other Abrahamic faith, a Muslim or a Jew, if you're a Hindu, whatever, nevertheless, actually, for a lot of what we're talking about here, it doesn't matter what you personally believe as in your own religious life. You don't need to be a Christian to recognize that this is where these ideas come from. I want you to be able to understand that so that you don't think that you can cut the roots off of the tree and keep enjoying the fruit. These ideas come from a certain place and have a certain history. And as I'm going to show, they don't just come from anywhere. That is, you can't just toss out these sort of central original ideas and guarantee that you're still going to have all of the good, nice things that are going to grow out of them like fruits out of a tree. You can't cut the roots away. And I get into these arguments on Twitter all the time where I'll say, your rights come to you from God. That's what it says. You are endowed by your creator with the right to inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's where they come from, whether you believe in God or not, right? And that's where the people who taught us that we have these rights, that's where they thought they come from. And people will say, no, it's intuitive to all, it's natural common sense. And one of the things we're going to get into at some length here is that there are things which are, as the founders said, self-evident, but they're not self-evident to us, not to people just born into the world naturally. Everybody just automatically knows, well, of course, right? We have to have our vision trained, our moral and our intellectual vision trained until we can see the purity of those self-evident truths. The self-evident things are the things you get to last after your training. That's something Aristotle talked about. We've dealt with it before. We're going to deal with it again. And so when I start quoting these Bible verses, people think, oh, he's just thumping his Bible at me. That's not what I'm doing at all. I'm telling you something important about the history of what you already believe, the passionate convictions that you have, right? I'm telling you where they come from, and I'm explaining the logic to you so that you think twice before you say, well, we can have all these good things, of course, without the religious reasoning, right? So that's the first thing. And this key phrase, the imago Dei, right? The image of God. Of course, it's not imago Dei in the Hebrew. It's B'Tselem, in the image of God, in his own image and in his own image and likeness. B'Tselem. And this comes into Latin as imago Dei, the image of God. And some people throughout the history of Christianity have argued that there's a difference between image and likeness, that because we have sinned and fallen, we are no longer like God in the way that we were meant to be, but we are still his image, which means that we are still his representatives on earth, and that's still the place we have in creation. Some people say, no, it's just one thing, the image, and that's a later addition. But either way, what does the image consist in? He says to the human couple, be fruitful and multiply. That's a command he gives them. But he actually gives that command to a lot of things. He tells the fish, he tells the fruits, he tells the beasts of the field, be fruitful and multiply. But what he doesn't say to them, that he does say to the man and woman, is, I have given you dominion. I have given you dominion over the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And in that capacity, at the very least, we are God's agents, his representatives on earth. And what does God do? He looks upon his creation and he calls it good. We are, as human beings who have conscious minds and can reason, we are the only ones who can see the fullness of the qualities in the world, the beauty, the yearning, the majesty. Some animals may have some connection to that, but we have the fullest version of that known in creation on earth, right? We are able to see things, call them good, judge between good and evil after the fall, right? And this equips us to be masters. It doesn't mean that we get to dominate, right? Having dominion doesn't mean, like mistreating God's creation or anything, but it does mean that we are equipped with the ability to see a beauty and to see truth. That's why we are in God's image. And even if we don't have that ability in full, or even if we don't exercise it well, nevertheless, we are the species that we are in is that kind of being. And this is crucial because, of course, some people, have see the world differently, or they have mental defects, or all these things. That does not mean that they're not created in God's image. Sin can mar the image, of course, and not just personal sin, but the fact that the world is broken. Nevertheless, we are of a species that sees and reasons, and therefore we are God's representative. And there's an important conclusion that we draw from this. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. This is a death penalty for murderers, and it's more importantly, a prohibition upon killing people because they are in the image of God, right? And we can see in there already that there is, a difficulty because we are given this solemn task of being God's executors on earth, right? We do sometimes have to take life if that is warranted by justice, but to do so simply out of desire or just because or out of sin, right? This is a sin against God because we are in his image, not because we somehow look like him, not because Jesus has a certain skin color or whatever, but because of the kinds of being that we are. And this is the reasoning. Some have called it the greatest gift of Judaism to the world. This is the reasoning that underpins the idea that if something is a human being, therefore it should be allowed to live. You exist on this earth because God desired that it should be so. He wanted you around. He thought it was good. He looked upon you and said it is good that you should be around. And therefore, right, all things that are humans, this is true of those things. Now, the question, of course, right, then becomes, can you believe this if you don't have the revelation of the Bible? We claim that these things are self-evident, and remember that we haven't gotten anywhere near talking about rights yet. Rights is a very modern concept, and that's part of the story I want to tell to you. Rights are a modern concept. I'm telling you where the underpinning of rights, the history of rights comes from, right? So the idea here is it's prohibited to kill a man or a person, a human being, because he or she is in the image of God, and that's where that comes from. So we haven't gotten to natural law, we haven't gotten to natural rights, we've just gotten to this sacred central principle which predates all of those ideas. The next question, of course, becomes, well, what if you are not a Christian? What if you're not a Jew? What if you're not of an Abrahamic faith at all, right? Do we then believe this? And the answer is, the record is a little bit spotty. And so this is the next thing that I remember I said to you, self-evidence doesn't mean that everybody at all times has just believed it, right? In fact, it turns out that if we look at the record in antiquity, some of our favorite people on this show, some of the folks whose reasoning and thought we most admire, did not believe in this idea that all people are inherently, as members of a species, created in this way that makes them equal on that level, right? This is the nature also of true equality, not that everybody's the same height or the same brain size or the same strength or anything like that, but all people, by virtue of their membership in the species human being, are in the image of God, and therefore their life must not be taken from them without just cause of law. Let me read to you now a passage from our old pal, Aristotle. And I'm going to read also a passage from Plato, his teacher. But Aristotle is one of the people that we haven't visited more recently. And so I wanted to read a passage from his Politics, his work on living in the polis, that is, in community under law. And in the polis is a city, right? So this is his work on the fundamental work on the art of living together in politics. Here's Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, Chapter 5. I'm reading here, as often, from a translation by Carnus Lord, really wonderful translation available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. Here's Chapter 5. It is in an animal that one can first discern both the sort of rule of a master and political rule. For the soul rules the body with the rule of a master, while intellect rules appetite with political and kingly rule. And this makes it evident that it is according to nature and advantageous for the body to be ruled by the soul, and the passionate part of the soul by the intellect, and the part having reason, while it is harmful to both if the relation is equal or reversed. The same holds with respect to man and the other animals. Tame animals have a better nature than wild ones, and it is better for all of them to be ruled by man, since in this way their preservation is ensured. Further, the relation of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. The same must of necessity hold in the case of human beings generally. Now, we can see some similarities here and some differences, right? Man is equipped in Aristotle as in Genesis. He's the one who rightly is equipped to rule over the world, the animals, right? Because they don't have his capacity for reason. They don't have his capacity even for artistic response, although he wouldn't have put it that way, right? But see where things go different here. He now says that this same distinction obtains within the species. So remember, I said in Genesis, and therefore in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, the species called human being is blanket, equally and without exception in the image of God, and therefore not therefore must be treated on some level as equal in that way, that they're not to have their lives taken. Aristotle now goes on to make distinctions within the species, right? Because he's following the same logic that he sees at work. He sees what the author of Genesis says also. He sees that there's natural hierarchy in the world, and he takes that further because he's following his human reasoning. He says, nature indeed wishes to make the bodies of free persons and slaves different, as well as their souls. Those of the latter strong with a view to necessary needs, and those of the former straight and useless for such tasks, but useful with a view to a political way of life, which is itself divided between the needs of war and those of peace. Yet the opposite often results, some having the bodies of free persons, while others have the souls. It is evident, at any rate, that if they were to be born as different only in body as the images of the gods, everyone would assert that those not so favored merited being their slaves. But if this is true in the case of the body, it is much more justifiable to make this distinction in the case of the soul. Yet it is not easy to see the beauty of the soul as it is that of the body, that some persons are free and others slaves by nature, therefore, and that for these slavery is both advantageous and just, is evident. This is an infamous argument. This is one thing that people might trot out if you say, oh, I'm interested in studying the classics of Western literature. I've listened to this podcast, Young Heretics. It's classical education. I love it. People will say, well, didn't Aristotle argue in favor of slavery? Now, some people will say, to be a doulos in the ancient world was not always the same as chattel slavery of the horrific kind we've seen in, America's past or in the past of much of the Western world and the world generally the world over, right? This is something I'm arguing here, is that the natural state of man is often to endorse these sorts of atrocities. And so some people might say, well, the doulos in classical culture, the servant, was really kind of a member of the family, even though he didn't have political rights, so on and so forth. But still, nevertheless, as Americans and as inheritors of the whole Western tradition, we have to look on this and say, either all men are created equal, or some men are born, as Jefferson later put it. I'm paraphrasing here, right? But with saddles on their backs, and other men with spurs, right? That some people are simply born to submit. That is what we don't believe, and that's one of the reasons why our hearts protest when bureaucrats come out and say, "Well, you have to get the COVID vaccine, and your objections don't matter, or you're just a stupid rube," right? We believe that all men are created equal. This comes back down to not making a distinction on these terms in terms of the worth of life, fundamental worth of life within the human species. And so Aristotle's not arguing that you should be able to simply kill people, but we're getting to that. And I'm going to now read to you from Plato as things get even hairier. Here's an ad that all my listeners can benefit from. It's Theragun. Literally everybody should try this out. I am a big evangelist for Theragun. I've been using them since before they were a sponsor. You guys know that I like to lift weights. You know that lifting weights often comes with a lot of soreness, and especially the elder you get, every year that goes by, you wake up, you're just a little bit more sluggish, a little more joint pain, whatever. Theragun is the handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension using a scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power, and it's as quiet as an electric toothbrush. Even if you are not a weightlifter like me, if you run, swim, bike, whatever, or just sit at a computer all day, you need Theragun to keep the tension of the day from weighing down on your body. The OLED screen and design make you feel like you're holding something from the future, which is awesome. Just go up to their site and check it out. You can try Theragun for 30 days, starting at only $199. This is just for my listeners, so you got to use my special link. It's therabody.com/heretics. Go there right now, therabody.com/heretics, and get your 30-day trial for only $199. That's an excellent deal on this product, and you will not regret it. You really will love using it. Therabody.com/heretics. Therabody.com/heretics. All right, here's a passage, another infamous passage that I've read to you before. And one of the things, again, if you're new here, one of the things that I'm really committed to is not shying away from these passages that confront us with the contradictions and the conflicts and the difficulties in Western history, because we have had these arguments before, and the record of them is also something to be cherished, right? The discussion, the difficult debate, the hideous things even that good people have said teach us something. It tells us that even good people can go horribly astray if not informed by the best wisdom available to them in their tradition. Here's Plato. He says, this is via Socrates, of course, in the Republic. There is a need for the best men to have intercourse as often as possible with the best women, and the reverse for the most ordinary men with the most ordinary women. And the offspring of the former must be reared, but not that of the others, if the flock is going to be of the most eminent quality. And all this must come to pass without being noticed by anyone except the rulers themselves, if the guardian's herd is to be as free as possible from faction. Now, again, we read this and we want to love Plato and Socrates. I love Plato and Socrates, and yet we cannot help but shudder. And you can see how the logic works, because if it's possible to make a distinction within the human species that goes down to the ground, not just, oh, this person's taller or this person is prettier or whatever, but this person is more or less worthwhile, more or less has more or less worth, is designed to serve, as Aristotle was saying, then ultimately, of course, inexorably, what's going to stop you from saying some babies should be brought to term, some should be reared, and some shouldn't, right? This is a collision course. I like to talk a lot on this show about the consonance and the harmony between Athens and Jerusalem, as it's called, these sort of two fountainheads of Western culture, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the pagan wisdom of antiquity in Greece and Rome. And I like to talk about how they've mediated their disagreements and how it comes down to us in this beautiful kind of package. But we also need to talk about the places where they simply and flatly do not agree, right? And here is one of those. These two things are on a collision course. The idea that you can make fundamental distinctions of worth between members of the human species, and the idea that full stop, all members of the human species have a certain baseline God-given right to life, as we would now call it. Although, again, let me remind you, right, that we haven't gotten anywhere near talking about rights yet. We're just touching upon the edge, the shore of the sea that is natural law or natural right. We're just getting down to this first fundamental question, because the first principles are important. First question that the West is faced with on this collision course is, can we make distinctions in terms of people's fundamental, essential goodness or mattering or worth, right? And so this is where we get to something like Plutarch and the life of Lycurgus. So this is a passage, another famous, infamous passage about Sparta now, not Athens. Remember, Plato and Aristotle are based in Athens, but Sparta, which left behind much less textual evidence, as much shadowier. And so people have raised these questions, but we've just seen in Plato himself, we've seen him putting this argument for, eugenics and certain forms of infanticide. And Plutarch tells us that this was practiced in Sparta. Here's section 16 of Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus. Offspring was not reared at the will of the father, but was taken and carried by him to a place called Lescae, where the elders of the tribes officially examined the infant. And if it was well built and sturdy, they ordered the father to rear it and assigned it one of the 9,000 lots of land. But if it was ill-born and deformed, they sent it to the so-called apothetai, a chasm-like place at the foot of Mount Taygetus, in the conviction that the life of that which nature had not well equipped at the very beginning for health and strength was of no advantage either to itself or the state. On the same principle, the women used to bathe their newborn babes not with water, but with wine, thus making a sort of test of their constitutions. For it is said that epileptic and sickly infants are thrown into convulsions by the strong wine and lose their senses, while the healthy ones are rather tempered by it, like steel, and given a firm habit of body. Their nurses, too, exercised great care and skill. They reared infants without swaddling bands, and thus left their limbs and figures free to develop. Besides, they taught them to be contented and happy, not dainty about their food, not fearful of the dark, nor afraid to be left alone, nor given to contemptible peevishness and whimpering. This is the reason why foreigners sometimes brought Spartan nurses for their children. Amycla, for instance, the nurse of the Athenian Alcibiades, is said to have been a Spartan. So, again, right, something that offends our modern sensibilities. But what I'm trying to force you to ask yourself here is why? Why does it offend your modern sensibilities? Are you smarter or better than Aristotle or Plato inherently? Or have you been taught by them things that they were not taught. And what I'm edging up to is the distinction here between reason and revelation. We see that the world around us provides us certain information and that we are naturally equipped with reason to make certain true judgments about it, such as, for instance, that men, human beings, right, are superior to animals in their intellect and therefore suited to rule. But we see in Aristotle that if you only have that reason, right, then it will lead you to places that we now see in their self-evident way as horrific, right? And we see Socrates, or Plato's Socrates, advocating eugenics, advocating killing babies. We hear this record of the Spartan practice, and who knows how widespread it was, but it must have existed, right? It was clear. There's clear evidence that it existed, and we have myths, of course, like the myth of Oedipus, to kind of speak to that idea. If you are only working on your human reason, no matter how smart you are, no matter how nice a person, no matter how good you are liable to go astray without certain forms of revelation, right? The distinction between reason and revelation is part of why we combine Athens with Jerusalem, because in order to come to the conviction that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, you need the revelation that God created mankind in his image. The imago Dei is essential here. It's not one of the things that you can just toss out as history progresses and still get along just fine with all your rights intact, still stay to be a nice person. The natural state of man without this revelation, whether you believe as I do that it truly came from God, or whether you think it's simply, some sort of just brain burst that somebody had one time, right? Whatever story you want to tell about how that text came into being, its revelation is essential if you want to live in a world where all men are created equal, where you are born free, where somebody can't just decide that you deserve to die. And we see this because we know that even the best societies of antiquity, without this revelation, did things that we now consider appalling. And the fact that we consider them appalling is not just because of our own intuitive excellence. It's because of the wisdom tradition that comes down to us through the great works of the West. That's why you're listening to this show. They will not be able anymore to argue on Twitter that, well, we can do without all that God stuff and still have rights. But again, let me stress, I want to stress this so many times, we have not gotten to rights yet, right? We haven't officially gotten to rights. I'm just talking to you about the history and the underpinning, and we're still in ancient history. The next thing I want to do is acknowledge that although it is possible for even good and smart pagans to advocate killing children, right? It's also possible for good and smart pagans to intuit something like the natural equality of all humans before God. And so I want to read to you now from some Stoics. We've talked about the Stoics before. After Plato, right? Plato's Academy is the school that kind of tries to carry forth some of what Socrates taught and the discussions he had with his students. Then Aristotle has his Lyceum, and there's this, tradition of philosophy in the West and in Athens, but during what's called the Hellenistic era, which begins with Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC and goes all the way up to 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, which we talked about way back when with Barry Strauss. That's when Rome basically makes its formal transition into empire, right? That period is called the Hellenistic era. And one of the things that happens is you get a proliferation of different kinds of schools. You have the Peripatetics, who are sort of Aristotelian followers. You have the Epicureans, who have a totally different, and I must say, frankly, rather kooky, although very familiar and recognizable worldview. We've talked about that before on the show. Now we talk also about the Stoics, whom we've mentioned before as one among this school. They met and talked in the Stoa Poikile, the painted colonnade or walkway, and that's why they're called Stoics. And they give their name now to this idea of being strong, right, and not being overwhelmed by your emotions, which was something that they believed, unlike the word Epicurean, which doesn't really mean anything about true Epicurean philosophy. But here is a Stoic writer, Seneca, who writes letters to a fellow named Lucilius. And he has these moral epistles, which you can get in really lovely volumes still. And Stoicism is having a bit of a vogue, a bit of a resurgence right now. So lots of people are reading this sort of thing. Marcus Aurelius, whom we've also talked about. I wanted just to read one passage from Epistle 47. And it begins this way. He says, "Your slaves are men." He's writing to Lucilius, remember, to a nobleman. "Your slaves are men, companions, humble friends. Indeed, they are your fellow slaves, if you consider how quickly fortunes can change. Kindly remember that he whom you call your slave sprang from the same stock, is smiled upon by the same skies, and on equal terms with yourself breathes, lives, and dies. It is just as possible for you to see in him a freeborn man as for him to see in you a slave. As a result of the massacres in Marius's day, many a man of distinguished birth who was taking the first steps towards senatorial rank by service in the army was humbled by fortune, one becoming a shepherd, another a caretaker of a country cottage. Despise then, if you dare, those whose estate you may at any time descend to, even when you are despising them. I want to make a note here, by the way, that when I'm talking about the Hellenistic era, I'm talking about the birth of the Stoic school. These guys are later, though. These Seneca and the guy I'm going to read to you next, Epictetus. Epictetus comes from the 2nd century AD, so we're into the Roman imperial period now. But the Romans were pretty big on Stoicism, and they would have people come from Greece and elsewhere to advise them on it. And so that's where we get this guy, Epictetus. Or that's the time frame during which we get this guy, Epictetus, who was himself a freed slave. So here's Epictetus' Discourses, book 1, chapter 13. How then shall a man endure such persons as this slave? He's talking about what if your slaves don't serve you well? He says, slave yourself. Will you not bear with your own brother, who has Zeus for his progenitor, and is like a son from the same seeds and of the same descent from above? But if you have been put in any such higher place, will you immediately make yourself a tyrant? Will you not remember who you are and whom you rule, that they are kinsmen, that they are brethren by nature, that they are the offspring of Zeus? So now we complicate the picture because we have two different kinds of view in antiquity, in pagan antiquity, right? We have this unequivocal proclamation in Genesis, right, that human beings are created in the image of God. And that leads on in tradition and in history to the decision not to make a distinction in terms of fundamental equality and worth of life, right, between different kinds of human beings. Then you have this pagan tradition, good philosophers, smart philosophers, nevertheless saying some people deserve to die, some people deserve to be slaves, right? And yet you also have a reaction against that. But what's that reaction based on? It's based on the common brotherhood of man as children of the same father, namely Zeus, namely from the divine, right? You know, people always wax poetic about the brotherhood of man. You know, they say, "Oh, we're all men are brothers, all men are together. It's the age of Aquarius, right? We all have we're all part of this big brotherhood of man." But nobody stops and thinks about what that language implies, right? Because if people are brothers, or if they're brothers and sisters, if they're siblings, then they have one father. They come from a single parent, right? And look, on earth, in earthly life, we don't all have the same father. You don't have the same father as me. None of you listening have the same father as each other, unless you're my sister, which, if you're listening, hi, Faith. We don't have the same father in earthly terms. What does it mean to say that we are a brotherhood of man? It means that we come from one heavenly father, which is God. And in relation to him, inside of him, we are all equal. So you can't just toss that idea away and still sort of assume the notion, right, that we are some sort of divine brotherhood, because to be brothers is to come from one father. So you can't just scrap these ideas. And as we are starting on, this collision course is really now getting going between these disagreements within pagan antiquity and this Christian, or rather Judeo-Christian tradition that is developing, the Christianities in its nascent stages. And that's what we're getting into next. We're going to talk about how early Christianity looks upon these pagan disagreements and this, argument over whether there is one brotherhood of man, whether all men are created equal, how the Christians regard this and how they select from the different pagan philosophies the strains that are consonant with the revelation of Jewish scripture. So that's what we're going to get into next. All right, calling all builders of the Young Heretics empire, which should be all of you. I want to tell you about True Bill, because you can't become a gajillionaire without saving money effectively, without making sure that your finances are in order. And a lot of you guys, I know, are letting money drain away because of unwanted subscriptions. You can always just tell when you open up your bank statement or whatever that there's this money going out the door that you are not using. You're paying for stuff. Maybe you signed up for FaceApp one time or whatever, and they just got you with this thing where they give you a free trial, you put in your credit card information, you cancel anytime, and then they make it impossible to cancel. You forget where to go, you forget it even exists, and before you know it, you're bleeding money, and your ex is watching your Netflix account, and you're not getting anything out of it. On average, people save up to $720 a year with True Bill. True Bill goes through your subscriptions and finds the ones you're not using. It's super easy to just tap and start canceling. People have been saving a ton of money. Here's one guy who says, in a matter of seconds, I saved $660 for the year on DirecTV, $120 on SiriusXM, $840 a year on car insurance. That's a ton of money. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. Make sure you use that link, truebill.com/heretics. heretics, it could save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/heretics. Let's get to Paul, our old buddy Paul, right? Initially Saul of Tarsus, right? Student of Gamaliel, passionate Pharisee, right? And persecutor of Christians, has this incredible life story, what we would now in Christianese and evangelical sources would call this a witness, a testimony, right? His witness, his story is that on the road to Damascus, he was struck by a vision of Christ, who said, "Why do you persecute me? Why do you go after the Christians?" Right? Converts, the scales, as it were, are first put onto and then fall from his eyes, and that's where we get that expression. And now we have Paul, the great expositor of early Christian theology, whose letters make up a large part of the New Testament. So you've got the four Gospels, then you've got the book of Acts, which comes right after Luke, and that's the story about the works of the disciples. And then you've got Paul's letters, in addition to the letters from a few other early churchmen. Paul writes his magisterial work right around the same time that Seneca, a little earlier, I think, than Seneca, is writing his letters. And so a lot of people have talked about this. I'm talking about the epistle to the Romans, right? So it makes a lot of sense that we're talking about these Roman interpreters of Stoic doctrine at the same time as we're talking about this Jew writing in Greek to the Romans, right? It all gets very complicated, and yet you see the connections between it, because here's this guy, he's writing to Rome, he's writing to the commercial and the military center of the world as far as he's concerned, right? The great power that is quickly emerging to dominate the Mediterranean, to dominate the world as people knew it. And he's writing to a budding church of Christians, which included Jews and Gentiles. So some Jews had converted to follow this new Messiah. And I say converted, but it would hardly have looked to them like a conversion so much as just like deciding on a question, right? Is this guy the Messiah who was foretold or not? And so that you've got those Jews, and then you've got some pagans who are saying, I think that this guy is the real deal. So they too are coming. Paul is writing into this context. He is well versed in Greek and Roman philosophy. He quotes poets like Aratus, who was a sort of Stoic inflected poet. And so people have argued, well, did Paul influence the Stoics? Did Stoics influence Paul? The Gospel of John also seems to have some Stoic kind of tinges to it. And so this is a longstanding scholarly question. We're not going to resolve it here because nobody's ever going to resolve it, I don't think, until Judgment Day. I really believe that it's impossible with these things. We don't have enough documentation to tell. But one thing we know, right, is that Paul and the gospel writers in general are sort of sympathetic to Stoicism because it is the strain of pagan philosophy that looks closest to the truth that they have arrived at through revelation and reason, right? So basically, you think about this collision course I've been talking about, you think about these two traditions, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the pagan philosophical tradition, and they're headed toward collision in Rome and in Paul, in the person of Paul. And as Paul is extracting what is good and what is not good out of this Greek philosophy, he's leaning naturally, of course, toward the same sorts of things that the Stoics are saying, because they are the ones who have argued against people like Aristotle, for instance, that there are no natural slaves in the sense of people who are, just born to rule and made to rule, and that all men are brothers because they all have one common father. Paul has a very famous passage in the letter to the Romans in which he talks about, well, how are we to regard these pagans, right? Who know things that seem to be true, and yet also we see them out here doing all kinds of debauched things. Of course, the Roman Empire at this stage, right, under Nero is just a complete funhouse of sin. And I say funhouse ironically, right? It's a carnival of sin. And he's saying, so they're obviously capable, as I have been arguing, it's possible for a reason without revelation to go terribly astray, for great civilizations, even great philosophers, to fall down the wrong path. And yet we also have to agree with them about some things. So how can we deal with this when they don't have the revelation of Scripture? Here's Paul, Romans 2, beginning at verse 12. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law here, remember, being the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, right, who do not have the law, do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. This work, the Epistle to the Romans, because it's part of the Bible, it doesn't get enough credit as being the revolutionary philosophical and theological text that it is. If this had been written by somebody like Epictetus, we'd be like, wow, one of the masterworks of Western literature. And it is one of the masterworks of Western literature. And I'm translating it, by the way, out of the Greek now on Locals for the VIPs. This is this community. My buddy Dave Rubin started this platform where you can get out of the thumb of big tech censorship. You can be in a direct relationship with people that want to hear more about this stuff. And that's what we're doing. It's an incredible community, youngheretics.com/locals. I'm commenting on Paul's epistle to the Romans chunk by chunk as I translate it as well. So if you're interested in that, head over to Locals. But for this purpose, right, what I'm talking about is this idea that when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required of the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. And I've brought this passage before you because whereas, again, we are still not in the realm of what you would call natural law theology or philosophy, we are laying the groundwork, right? In this meeting of the minds between the Stoic tradition, the pagan tradition generally, and the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is convicted and committed to all men are created in the image of God, right? Let us make mankind in our image. In this meeting of the minds, we get Paul's assertion that there is a certain amount of human access to these truths because they are truths per se. The only way to guarantee that you'll get the truth in Paul's eyes and in mine is to incorporate the revelation, to read the scripture. But it's also possible, although not guaranteed, that people will intuit this from the law that is written on the heart, right? And so this is why, again, what I'm arguing is not that like no society ever has been okay without Christianity. No society has ever thought of the idea that, people are worthwhile or something, but that it's simply not a guarantee that you will just building a society from scratch will just naturally through your common sense see that mankind is made in the image of God, right? That comes from somewhere. It comes from revelation. It grafted onto reason in the person of Paul. And so now we get to this idea, right? That, basically, because Paul kind of won this fight, because the pagan philosophies have kind of fallen out of favor, nobody's, people read them a lot. They kind of adopt new versions of their practices sometimes, but nobody's out here really officially, starting a major millions of people wide school of Stoicism. Christianity won this fight, and it did so by incorporating the best that came from the law that was written on the heart and showing how it was consonant with the truth that came in Revelation and that came in the gospel. Outside of that tradition, it's a howling wasteland, man. You are not guaranteed to find the truths that you so value, that you intuitively and instinctively now see to be true. You see them to be self-evident because you have been trained by a society which still, even at its advanced stage of decay, has taught you these things. Many people don't remember where they come from. They are vestigial, and as Nietzsche observed, right, he pointed out that eventually they will be discarded, and we're going to get to that in a later episode. That, if you cut these roots out, the tree's going to keep producing fruit for a little while. And so people are still going to say, well, my right to freedom, my dignity, my human rights, right? But eventually, when you take the justification for this away, you are not going to like the results. And so we're going to get into that as I hinted and indicated with the abortion thing and with the euthanasia thing. But we have miles to go before we sleep. We have a long journey to take before we talk about that. Let me read to you now the introduction into true natural law theology, and that's with my man Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas, right, a big 13th century AD genius, philosopher, theologian, Catholic, and beloved of Catholic philosophers generally, but also of natural law theorists. His Summa Theologiae, the kind of encyclopedic treatise on all things relating to the Christian faith, right? Every question that you might want to know, you can look it up in this encyclopedia, and he will give you both what people say about it. This is sometimes called the Aristotelian dialectic or the endoxic method, right? Here's what people say. Some people say, I answer that, right? Here are my answers to the objections. And this is how you get the form of the Summa Theologiae, because Aquinas big fan of Aristotle and baptizer, it's sometimes said, of Aristotle, in that he takes the stuff that's in Aristotle and he shows how everything that's true in Aristotle can be expressed and consummated in the Christian faith. That's why people love him, is because he is one of the great presiders over the marriage between Athens and Jerusalem. And here's what he has to say about this whole question, the law that is written on the heart. Just as man impresses a kind of inward principle of action on the man that is subject to him, so God imprints on the whole of nature the principles of its proper actions. And so in this way, God is said to command the whole of nature. According to Psalm 148, he hath made a decree, and it shall not pass away. And thus all actions and movements of the whole of nature are subject to the eternal law. Consequently, irrational creatures are subject to the eternal law, though being moved by divine providence, but not as rational creatures are through understanding the divine commandments. Now, this is a big subject that I'm going to read some more of Aquinas in a second. But remember that if you remember when we talked about this before, right, there are 4 types of law in Aquinas. There's the eternal law, which is God's absolute truth. There's the natural law, which is what we're getting into here. And that's like when God's absolute truth shines into nature, like light through a window. And so you get animals and nature and even the bounce. I mean, he wouldn't have known about this, right? But the DNA that spins out code inside of you, right? The wonder and the majesty of every particle of creation is following certain rules, as our scientists love to remind us. And typically, of course, you'll get somebody like Stephen Hawking say, well, these laws of nature are sufficient to create the universe. Of course, whose laws, right? The laws of nature, the laws of physics, the laws of gravity, right? I guess I should actually rather say Einsteinian relativity, right? The laws of quantum particular physics, they dictate how the world works. And mankind, says Aquinas, has a special role in that he can intuit, he can understand the law and act according to it. That's why we're rational animals, right? Man is a rational animal, old ancient philosophical dictum. And so that's natural law. Then you have human law, which is the attempt to write laws in the state that conform with what we understand of both of natural law and of revealed law or divine law. So divine law is like in the Torah, right? You have these rules for life that come from revelation over and above what we're able to intuit and understand in nature. That's why we're talking about reason and revelation, right? But I want to focus here on the natural law because that's really what our subject is. So this idea that we have minds that can not only do we have bodies like animals that behave according to God's command and how the world works, right? But also the precepts of the natural law are to the practical reason what the first principles of demonstrations are to the speculative reason, because both are self-evident principles. Now we're getting into this self-evidence thing, right? Now a thing is said to be self-evident in 2 ways. First, in itself. Secondly, in relation to us. Any proposition is said to be self-evident in itself if its predicate is contained in the notion of the subject. Bear with me here. Aquinas always gets into the weeds, but I promise we will untangle them. Although, to one who knows not the definition of the subject, it happens that such a proposition is not self-evident. For instance, this proposition, man is a rational being, is in its very nature self-evident. Since who says man says a rational being. He says it's contained in the definition of man that it's a rational being. That's what you say when you say man, right? And yet, to one who knows not what a man is, this proposition is not self-evident. Hence it is that, as Boethius says, certain axioms or propositions are universally self-evident to all, and such are those propositions whose terms are known to all, as every whole is greater than its part, and things equal to one and the same are equal to one another. But some propositions are self-evident only to the wise, who understand the meaning of the terms of such propositions. Thus, to one who understands that an angel is not a body, it is self-evident that an angel is not circumscriptively in a place, but this is not evident to the unlearned, for they cannot grasp it. So, here we have the proper way to understand the Founder's Declaration that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Because now that we don't understand these ideas, right? Now that we think, oh, self-evidence just means it's common sense. Everybody thinks this, right? So we now think that the Declaration of Independence tells us something that everybody already knew, right? But that's not what the founders were saying at all. They knew what I am saying, which is that there's no guarantee, no matter how smart you are, no matter how nice, no matter how good, there's no guarantee you're just going to spring fully formed into the world like Athena from the head of Zeus with your certainty that all men are created equal. Instead, they are self-evident in that they are contained in the definition of man. And the way we know this, again, is from the revelation that man is created in God's image. That's why they said that he is endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? And again, haven't gotten to rights yet, but We have now officially gotten to natural law, which is self-evident in the sense that it is purely true and it is axiomatic. That is, it's contained in the definition of the words we're using if we're going to use them properly. And practical reason, right, is the phronesis in Greek, is the process, the ability and the procedure of reaching out into that, seeing that light, right, which shines through the window, eternal law, above all time and place, the same everywhere and always, perfect in God, right? Natural law in God's creation is like how that light refracts into all the many situations that we might find ourselves in. And that's why, as Aquinas is keen to stress, practical reason dictates different things in different times and places. Today, maybe it's important for me to stress that the free market is good, right? I always believe that, but perhaps in the Soviet Union, up against the Soviet Union, it's good to stress that, right? But then, as I've argued later, like now Disney owns its own county government. It's hostile to the will of the people. Now I need to stress that the rights the government gives, government can take away, whereas the rights that God gives, nobody can take away. Government can only protect. So I talked about that on a previous episode. But my point is, right, practical reason dictates different things at different times, but it's always the process of reaching up to eternal law as expressed or propounded in natural law, and understanding it and acting on it. That's how this stuff works. That's how you get human law, with the addition, of course, of divine law. All right. Now we're really getting somewhere, right? And this is, you can see why the people that love this stuff love it. And I'm one of the people that loves this stuff. I think you can be too. It sounds so complicated at first, and it's complicated in one sense in that there's a long history, lots of text to talk about, lots of stuff we're even leaving out, right? But in some senses, it's not complicated because it deals with these first principle questions, these basic things. And once you break it down the way we're doing, once you start seeing these long histories of arguing and coming to certain conclusions and winning and losing and fighting it out, right? Then you know that you can't just take this stuff for granted. You can't just kick the stool out from underneath you and fly. You are standing on the shoulders of giants, as is famously said, right? And this stuff comes from somewhere. There are certain pillars that are load-bearing, meaning that if you remove them, the building falls down. And one of the reasons why we're talking so much about rights, we all know we believe in rights, but we keep seeming to enter into these hellish nightmare landscapes where in the name of rights, we compromise, obviously, people's rights, where we do hideous things to people, to babies, to the elderly. One of the reasons is because we're talking about rights without any solid ground to stand on, understanding where they come from. Again, you can be an atheist. You're allowed to be, but your beliefs don't make sense unless you at least agree that all people who believe that mankind is created equal, right? That there is no fundamental distinction within the human species. All those people who believe it in a sound, logical way believe it because we have one Father, and that is God, right? Or the divine, right? In some pagan cases. That's what I want to stress to you today. And we're going to get into the moderns next week as we start to talk about the thorny issue, right, of rights. And like I said, we've now been inching up to the shore, right? And now we're ready to start talking about natural rights, which again is very, very different from everything we've been talking about, except that everything we've been talking about underpins all the conversation that we're going to have next week about natural rights. Every time I talk about American Hartford Gold, it gets more urgent. I feel like at a certain point, I'm just going to reach through your computer screen and grab you by the lapels and shake you and say, what are you waiting for? Everything is so expensive. The inflation problem is not going away. I regret to inform you. Stuff keeps getting more expensive. Your money keeps being worth less and less. This is the government's fault. No question about it. Joe Biden is shrinking your personal paycheck, reaching into your pocket. It's the biggest economic crisis since 2008. So how do you protect your money, your retirement, your savings? American Hartford Gold can show you how to hedge your hard-earned savings against inflation by helping you diversify a portion of your portfolio into physical gold and silver. I have a lot of friends that are starting to do this, the smart ones at least, and I recommend you do it too. They will even help move your existing IRA or 401k out of the volatile stock market into a precious metals IRA. They are the highest rated firm in the country with an A+ rating from the BBB and thousands of satisfied clients. Now, my listeners only can get this awesome deal of up to $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. That's up to $1,500 of free money when you text the word heretics, HERETICS, to 65532. One more time, that's heretics. Text the word to the number 65532. Don't wait. Check them out today. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. Like I said, that's where we're building this great community of VIPs. If you go over to youngheretics.com/locals, you will become a VIP and you will get that translation of Paul of Romans that I was talking about. You'll get the commentary that I'm writing gradually on it. and you will get to ask questions and be in the mailbag. So here's a question from Jay Tobler. How much sci-fi do you read? What makes good sci-fi? What makes bad sci-fi? What's the most common sin of bad sci-fi that drives you nuts? Okay, so when I first read this question, my immediate response was to say, I don't really read any sci-fi. I don't really read much sci-fi. Like, there's big sci-fi nerds out there. I feel like I'm not one of them. And then I thought, well, I've read a lot of Isaac Asimov, and I've read a lot of H.G. Wells, and I've read The Martian, and I've read Arrival, and I actually think I read a lot of sci-fi. And so it's so interesting to me. Even I think that, I'm always pounding my fist and saying, like, pop art can be good art, right? And yet I think even I have this prejudice where I'm like, oh, I don't read that much sci-fi, except in my spare time I read a little bit. But no, actually, I think I read a fair bit of sci-fi. And I think that at a more fundamental level, one reason why I find myself reading a lot of sci-fi is because we live in this highly scientistic age. And as C.S. Lewis points out in his sci-fi, that is the space trilogy, right? There is a mythology which attends upon science. We can't help but build one because we are not just purely sort of mathematical animals. We are rational animals, but we also have hearts, right? And so we see these wonders and these mysteries, and we learn these things, and we want to tell stories about them. And so I think that the biggest sin of sci-fi that drives me nuts is actually materialism, right? So sci-fi that simply like thinks of us as atoms and then tries to build some grand, beautiful narrative about it. It's one of my problems actually with a lot of multiverse stories, right? Is that they tell the story like we're just this random fart of a universe producing machine, and then somehow we're supposed to have heroism, and we're supposed to have, the Eternals was a great example of this. It's like they win this victory. Sorry for the spoiler. They win this victory that causes the heat death of the universe, or like will cause the heat death of the universe. And they're like, was this right or wrong? I don't know. There's no ultimate authority in this endless cosmos of atoms bouncing off one another. So Epicureanism and materialism drive me insane in sci-fi. Some people make this distinction like hard sci-fi that is genuinely just a thought experiment about some scientific thing versus soft sci-fi, which is kind of like a space opera. So like a difference between Isaac Asimov's Foundation and Star Wars, say. Foundation, hard sci-fi, Star Wars, soft sci-fi. And some people would probably be even more hardcore and say, well, Foundation isn't even hard enough. But like for me, I like both, actually. I really like them both. And one of my favorite kinds of sci-fi is the kind like early Black Mirror episodes on Netflix, where the thing that is technologically advanced is just one step away from what we currently have. So I love it when they're like, the world is insane. They have like, dating apps in virtual space or whatever, but it's just one thing that you could actually see them doing like tomorrow. And that's the best dystopia and the best positive vision for the future. Because they help us to think, I mean, that's really all any story, any sci-fi or fantasy story is like thinking about ourselves in a mirror, in a kind of bent mirror or a funhouse mirror, right? Like, well, what if we had this? What if we did that? So early Black Mirror episodes do this. Childhood's End is a wonderful book and series that does this. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's really cool. I don't have time to talk about the story. I don't want to spoil it for you. But yeah, I think sci-fi is becoming more and more important as our technology becomes more and more central. We're going through a technological revolution. And in those times, technology becomes central, science becomes central. Major questions about the role of science in the spiritual life become central. So I hope that's been some good recommendations. And we'll talk on Locals today, actually, on the live stream about your thoughts. We'll have a discussion. That's another thing we do over on Locals. One more time, it's youngheretics.com/locals. That is it for me. If you like this show, and especially if you like thinking about natural law, natural right, the Declaration, all that stuff, you should go check out the Claremont Institute. They are my employers, and a lot of guys who are really smarter than me, are out here talking about that in really urgent and interesting ways for the modern day. It's claremont.org. It's claremont.org/donate to help support our work. And our publications are called the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. All right, folks, thanks for listening. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.